All right, thank you everyone for joining us. This is our monthly webinar series, and today, as you can see, we're going to be speaking about handling conflict in a conflicting world. I think this is a topic that we have all encountered probably for a very long time, if not in our professional lives, then in our personal lives. And so I hope that today's webinar will encourage you to maybe think of a few different ways of, or new ways of handling or mitigating conflict, maybe resolving conflict in a new way, trying a new method or tool. But I hope it ends up being well worth your time. So let's jump in. For those of you that are not familiar with EZSigma Group, we have been around since 2000. We actually began as a tech company, and within our first couple of years moved more into the training and consulting realm, which is where we have been focused for nearly 20 years now. We are very passionate about continuous improvement. We specialize in Lean Six Sigma tools and methodology. But you can see on your screen our vision and mission. And so we also understand the relevancy and the importance of developing our soft skills as well, because it goes hand in hand with project management, with continuous improvement, and all of that area. So we do offer a realm of different solutions to our clients depending on what their needs may be, whether that's consulting or software, training, statistical analysis. So again, if any of these are of interest to you, feel free to reach out anytime. So I'm Elizabeth Jamischak. I've been with EZSigma since 2006. So for those of you that are familiar with us, I'm sure you have seen my name around over the years. And I'll be speaking today on this topic. And where I'm coming from is not only my experience with EZSigma, but also just experience I've had as a board director, sitting on several boards, leading different nonprofit organizations and events. Also, some of the work that I did before joining EZSigma. And in every one of these areas, I've always come up with conflict in some realm, and not only professionally, but personally. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be speaking about today are either things that I've seen or used and have found that it really works well, combined with some of the research that I've been doing on this topic over the past couple of years since we've been within this current pandemic. And it seems to have brought on a lot of new types of conflict. So today's webinar, the point is to talk about how to recognize conflict, how to resolve it, and how to mitigate it. So just before we jump in, quick housekeeping. I'm going to ask everyone if you can mute your microphones just for to avoid any background noise from coming in. That would be fantastic. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you. You can also see past webinars on our website or on our YouTube channel. So I just want to start with a question for a bit of self-reflection, and this is, how do you view conflict? And I'd like you to kind of keep this in the back of your mind and really be honest with yourself. Is conflict to you always a negative or primarily a negative? Is it a positive thing, or is it more neutral? How do you genuinely and honestly view conflict? Because that's going to impact the way that you handle it, the way you deal with it, and the way that you help others through conflict, especially for those of you that are in more of a leadership role. So again, please keep this kind of in the back of your mind as we're going through today's webinar. And I want to start off with a question for everybody. I'm going to ask you to open up your chat window, and I'd love to see just some of your thoughts on what are some triggers for conflict. So give a minute or so if you can put in some of the triggers. Thank you, Scott. I see schedule, time constraints, differences, motivations. Yeah, that's a big one. Opposing views, definitely. Opinions, views, yeah. Lack of a shared vision. A new person, yes, that can definitely add a lot of conflict, lack of clarity, different perspectives. And looking at these responses that everyone has put in so far, thank you very much for that. Maybe you can see a bit of a trend that it's all really focused around people, and there seems to be a lot of consensus here as far as the communication side and the understanding side from people, and we're going to be talking quite a bit about that today. We've got some more different end goals, time constraints, lack of clarity, staff. So again, still all really related to people and understanding people. And if you happen to think of any more as we go through this, feel free to keep adding that into the chat. So I want to begin with people, and understanding people really, for me, is kind of the foundation of how to handle conflict effectively. And so some of you may be already familiar with temperament theory. The idea, and there's been a form of this theory around for centuries, but what the idea is that people are pretty much divided into 4 types of temperament categories. Now, everyone may have a combination of 2, 3, or even all 4 of these types of temperaments, but primarily you'll see one that really is dominant within the way a person reacts to things and how they handle life and situations. And so I've put an example on the screen which really gives a good idea of what these 4 different types of temperaments are. So for instance, the catalyst would be the person that generally says, I've got an idea, so that visionary. The theorist is the person that says, hey, that's interesting, let's make a plan, let's make it happen. Side note, that's where I tend to be. Stabilizer tends to be the person that slows things down, that says, look, we need to look at the data, we need to think about it, we need to determine the risks. Improviser is generally the person that says, well, let's just do it and figure it out as we go. And when you think about this and you get these types of personalities, temperaments together, it really is a melting pot for how conflict can arise. And so something that I would encourage all of us, myself included, is to really take a look and see, what is my tendency? So when I'm provided with a new situation or a new circumstance, or if conflict arises, where does my gut generally take me? And especially if you're in a leadership role, and something else that I would strongly recommend is getting to know your team in a way that you can understand how they're typically going to react to something. Because what that will do is it'll prepare you ahead of time and allow you to come up with the idea of where the conversation most likely is going to go. Where are the questions or concerns typically going to arise, so that you can enter into this conversation, you can enter into the situation with a better understanding and much more prepared on how to handle things effectively, without trying to figure it out when you're in the moment, when the stress is happening, when emotions are already on the table. Something else is that we all come to the table with assumptions and with biases. And this is another really important thing that I would encourage all of us to do, is to take a self-check and say, hey, what are my assumptions? What are the biases? What are my experiences that I'm bringing to this situation that's coloring or impacting the way I'm going to react? So, for instance, think about it if you're asked to attend a training seminar or something along those lines. Is your reaction to say, hey, this is fantastic, I get to learn something, I get to improve my skill set, I get to network? Or do you tend to be someone else that says, this is probably going to be a waste of time. I could be more effective doing my other work. How's this going to work? And so what assumptions are those coming from? Past experiences you've had with training? Are those coming from stories you've heard from colleagues about how training, or stories that you've heard about the actual trainer? So understanding where these are coming from and understanding what these are will empower you to be able to have more dialogue and have more conversations. So I can then approach my manager and say, hey, look, these are my concerns, and actually bring the conflict, bring that issue to the forefront ahead of time so that it's not bubbling under the surface. And again, the same thing goes if you're in a leadership position. What are the assumptions that you're bringing? Are you assuming that your team is going to be excited to do training? Or are you also assuming that this is not going to be effective, it's going to put all your projects behind, and that you're going to have to work overtime? And why are you making those assumptions? So you can see I've got a link here to a YouTube video. I'm not going to play it now. If there's time at the end, I may play it then, but otherwise, I will send you this link. It's a 2-minute clip. It's a cute little video from Seinfeld about where our assumptions can take us if we don't keep them in check, and how they can send us to places that cause far more conflict than there needs to be. So I want to take a moment here and before we dive any deeper and talk about some of the responsibilities of leaders. And just again, a quick refresher here. And you can see there's 5 primary responsibilities I've listed. The first one is direction, and that's putting the direction for the team, for the project, for whatever that may be that you're dealing with. Protection is another leadership responsibility, and by protection, I'm talking about creating a safe place for your team, for creating that psychological safety, for creating a place where people feel comfortable talking, sharing their opinions, even giving voice when they disagree with something, with maybe the direction, and knowing that they can actually have a conversation about it. By orientation, I'm talking about leaders shifting if it needs to happen, where the team is going, how a project is working. It could also be reorienting the organization. So there are a few options there for that. Managing conflict is when you're actually in the thick of it, in the heart of conflict. And the last responsibility really is about shaping norms. So how does your team function together? How do you deal with it? And I'm just going to send a quick reminder, if you could just mute your speakers for the background noise, that would be definitely appreciated. So these are the leader's responsibilities, generally working with teams. So we've kind of set the stage now. We've talked about different types of personalities, how that could bring up some conflict in and of itself, just simply by the way that we approach things. What our assumptions may be, that we do actually come to the table with assumptions and with our own personal bias, and how that could have impact conflict, and how it could also bring in conflict to a situation. And then we've also looked at, from the leader's perspective, what are their responsibilities and how do they actually manage the team and move things forward, and perhaps where are some opportunities to mitigate some conflict before it actually arises. So let's dig in a little bit more. And I would encourage us all really to take a step when conflict comes up and really try and understand what is going on. So what is causing the conflict? What is the risk associated with this conflict? who is engaged, who is maybe causing the conflict, or what might be the underlying cause of it. It may not be this final issue that's come up. It could actually be the conflict is something that happened maybe a few weeks ago, a few months ago, or that never really got resolved. And this was just the straw that broke the camel's back that set everything aflame. And again, this is something, understanding conflict and asking these kind of questions are applicable not only in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives when we come into contact and conflict with our family and friends to try and understand what's going on. Now, these questions are difficult. They can be a bit of a challenge to really get that perspective and to really be able to step back, get more of a bird's eye view on a situation. But one of the ones that I find the most challenging, at least for me over the years, has been this last question, is to truly be honest with myself and ask, am I the one that's creating the conflict? Am I the one that maybe I've got a competing value or vision? Maybe I'm not really aligned to my organization or to what this project is supposed to be helping us accomplish. Or it could also be, for instance, as a leader, am I putting too much work on my staff? Am I asking too much of them? Or am I maybe not asking enough? And then when I push a little bit, they're becoming resentful. So there, again, understanding and really getting to the root cause of what's going on is the beginning of being able to have that dialogue and that understanding to know how to actually resolve the conflict effectively. So once we get a better picture of understanding what the conflict is and getting down to that root issue, these are some steps that I've followed, that I've seen other organizations follow in teams. Not always all of them, but they followed several of them, and it really has made a big difference. And the first one is to actually acknowledge the conflict. And again, this can be something that people will struggle with, in being in denial that there's a problem. And I'm sure many of us on this call have been in a situation where we can see that there's a problem, but other people don't see it. They just want to say everything's great, everything's fine, everything's happy. It's like the Canadian, how's it going? Oh, great. Nobody wants to talk about what's really going on under the surface. So being able to step up and say, hey, there really is something going on, bring it to the surface and acknowledge it, really is the first step. And drawing it out so that you don't allow it to, as it says on the screen, simmer under the surface. Because again, what that can do is it can trigger different conflict down the road and make it more difficult to figure out what is the root cause of this future issue that may pop up. Or it could also build resentment, and that's never good for a team or for a couple of people when there's that underlying animosity happening. So, and part of being able to draw it out is having that safe space to do it. And if you're in a leadership role, then you are in a great position to be able to lead the way on building that safety, building that environment and that culture for your team where they feel comfortable coming to you. But if you're not in that formal leadership role, then you can still help to bring a safe space if you and your colleague are having an issue. You can be the one that initiates and acknowledges it and says, hey, look, we've got an issue and I'd really like to come to some kind of resolution with you so that we can work together because we both want to accomplish A, B, or C, or whatever it may be where the conflict's coming from. Allowing for there to actually be dialogue and debate can also be a challenge, but when it happens, when there's that safe space that's created and people are allowed to actually talk about the issues that they're seeing, talk about where they may not agree with a decision that's happened or a direction that's going, again, will help to root out if it's some underlying cause or if the surface issue really is the problem. And it will also help you to understand whether the conflict is coming from a decision, a situation, or if it's a personality clash. Because those two types of conflict, there could be different consequences to each one. If it's two people that simply are fighting heads because they have a different personality, because one's a visionary and one's a I need the data, I need to know, and they're resenting there, then there's a different problem to solve. Or if it's two people that are saying, hey, this is part of our strategic plan, person A says, I think we should take this path, person B says, I think we should take this path, well, then again, that creates a different type of conversation. And something that's also very important with having these is maintaining your focus. And what are we trying to go towards? So understanding what has caused the conflict. So where is the detail, and why is that not allowing us to get where we want to go? Something else that also I've seen where some teams have broken down and they haven't been able to push through and get a proper resolution is they've been afraid to maintain the conflict. And a lot of us really don't enjoy conflict. I don't enjoy it myself either, but understanding that you need to push through and that there is going to be a period where it's uncomfortable for everybody. But if you can get past that, then that will allow for the win to happen, for the opportunity and for the positive outcome to present itself. Following that, looking at patterns, especially if you're in a leadership role, you can look at your team as a little bit of reflection, or as you're dealing with the conflict to say, hey, this happened, something similar 3 months ago or a month ago. How did we handle it? How did we come out of that? Could a solution similar help us in this situation? Or if you're looking at this as an individual, well, do I have any patterns? What are my triggers that cause conflict, that cause me to get my walls up or my heckles up? And how did I get through this before? Or what are some ways that didn't work that I can maybe try something new moving forward to help to resolve this conflict? And again, just keeping that focus and keeping that goal, that shared vision in mind, again, will help to keep the focus off of each other, will keep the focus away from getting personal, making personal shots at each other, and keeping it on what is going on. Now, again, as I mentioned, if it is a personality difference, you can still keep that shared vision to say, hey, you may have different approaches, but each person on this team, each person in this conflict still has a lot of value, and they bring different things to the team in different ways to approach a situation, which makes the team better as a whole. So once we take a step to understand, we've gone through, we've started to deal with the conflict itself. So how do we now get to the resolving? How do we really fix the problem, and how do we move forward? And then we'll deal with a bit of mitigating for future times when conflict is going to arise, because there's absolutely no doubt that we're going to face conflict on a fairly regular basis throughout our lives and careers. So I've mentioned this before, get the dialogue going to dig deeper into the conflict, find out what really is going on. And a key to that is creating that safe space, creating a place where people are willing to open up, are willing to share what is actually bothering them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's unpleasant. And we can do this as individuals. We can also do this if we're in a leadership role or in a team role to help contribute to creating that space where dialogue can actually happen and where people can talk about what's going on maybe under the surface. Taking responsibility is a huge part of this as well. And unfortunately, I've seen over the years that our culture in many ways has moved from being it's not you, it's me, to it's not me, it's you. So a lot of people don't like to take responsibility for what's going on anymore, even if they're in the wrong or whatever the case may be. And it might be because they're afraid of the consequences, or it could be for, again, something that's happened in the past where they felt that they got burned. There's that old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Well, if that's your thinking, then that is going to frame how willing you're going to participate in helping someone in the future. But being able to take responsibility and to say, hey, we've got a problem, or I've raised the problem, or we as a team, we need to step up and we need to get better because this isn't working, this is broken, will go a huge way to also creating that safe space and showing that bit of humbleness and openness and willingness to connect with other people on a deeper level. Working for collaboration between opposing viewpoints. This can be a challenge if people aren't open, if they're so focused on their own frustration or their own anger. But again, getting opposing views to come, or something that I've seen some managers do is they've had opposing views switch views and argue for the opposite side. And that really helps also with perspective and really can help to open up the conversation and bring it along. Willingness to sacrifice is another big one. Whether people are willing to step back and say, hey, what might be best for me isn't necessarily best for the team, but I'm going to put the team ahead of my own personal ambition or my own personal views on this point. This is something that as a board director, it's taught me quite a bit, helped me to be quite a bit more humble in some areas when perhaps I haven't actually agreed with the decision that the board has made. However, for the benefit of the organization and to help us move forward, I've agreed and said, okay, I will support this, even though it's not really what I think we should do. Instilling self-confidence. Again, this will help your team and to feel confident enough to speak up when they think that there's either a conflict arising or when a conflict has come up and you want to get some information from them. No forced consensus. This is another issue that I've seen arise where people think that the only way to resolve a conflict is for every person to come together and agree on the solution. But again, as I mentioned in my example that I've had as a board director, is that that's not always the best way to resolve the conflict. Sometimes all you need is for people to voice their concerns, for their concerns to be heard and acknowledged, but then they'll still agree to go with whatever majority rules or whatever the team decides. And this is also part of framing the conversation in the beginning. So as you're talking about what the conflict is, digging deeper, setting up some of those guardrails or boundaries to say, hey, where we're moving towards to find a solution is that we don't necessarily need to have a full consensus, but we want everybody on board to support whatever decision ends up being had. So if people understand from the get-go that that's where you're moving to, that can also in and of itself help to relieve some of the tension and some of the conflict. Making sure that you do bring different options to the table. Because again, if there's just two options, then that can easily turn into a competition instead of a discussion and instead of finding whatever's best for the project, the team, or whatever the situation may be. And relieving tension somehow, throwing in maybe a joke or lightening up the situation, even getting people to stand up and switch chairs in the middle of it can give people that moment of pause to kind of relax, take a deep breath, refocus, and if they're sitting in a different chair, maybe even see something from a different perspective. It sounds like a small thing, but again, it can be incredibly effective to help move things forward and to keep it positive. instead of focusing on the negative. So this is a great little image that I found on an HBR article. Again, you can see the link to the full article below when you receive a copy of this deck. And I thought it was very succinct. It gave some great tips and kind of summarized what I mentioned there about focusing on issues, not the personalities, focusing on collaborating for the best decision for the team, not necessarily focusing on a consensus. And something that is also very important is getting that sense of fairness and equity throughout the process. And what can go a long way to help with that is also making sure that everybody is heard and acknowledged, regardless of whether they are a assenting or dissenting point of view. So now I want to spend a few minutes before we finish up just about mitigating conflict. So how do we help to prevent this so that we don't get to those horrible, difficult situations when we're in the thick of conflict? You've heard me say several times psychological safety, creating that safe place for people to come to you, or as an individual or as a leader, whatever situation it is, to be able to say, hey, I've got an issue, I don't agree with this, or I think this would be better for us. And that goes hand in hand with building that trust with your colleagues, with your superiors, with your team, whatever it may be. Something else is allowing for conflict. Don't be afraid of it. Conflict is a great opportunity to be creative, to find new ideas, to grow closer as a team. And this goes back to my very first question is, how do you view conflict? Do you view conflict as something that's positive or something that's negative? Something else to help is making sure that you and or your team always knows what the end goal is, so that that becomes the focus, and the conflict is only part of the road to get you there. The focus doesn't become the conflict. Looking for collaboration on whatever the idea may be. So talking to people, getting their opinions as much as you can before going forward with something, so that people, when they hear an announcement or when you make a decision, they know, hey, I've already spoken about this, and they can trust that their leader or their management has already taken my thoughts or viewpoints on this into consideration. Something which ties into the third point here is assuming that conflict is normal. And that, I'm sure, again, we can all agree that we've all dealt with conflict in different areas of our life. And try to stay away from groupthink. And this is something that I think as a whole in business we're starting to become more aware of and move away from it. Groupthink, when you look back over the past decades, and just my own experience, it seemed to be much more prevalent when you'd have one or two people that were very confident and would speak out, and everybody else would just kind of follow along. And that was the culture for a lot of organizations, and that's really how a lot of leaders used to lead. But that does a disservice to the team, to the leader, to the individual, because it prevents from innovation, it prevents creativity from being as robust and as great as it can actually be, and coming up with some great new solutions. So, as mentioned, here's a few references. I may add a few more before sending you a copy of today's deck. And I just want to thank everybody. I've got a few more slides here before I finish up, but if you have any questions, I will remain on the line for a few minutes afterwards, or you're more than welcome to use the chat window. And again, I want to thank everyone for putting in your answers at the beginning of today's meeting, just with different things that bring up conflict. As far as EZSigma group, if you're interested, we've got a facilitation skills program coming up on December 7th, and that's being led by Tony White. This is an amazing course. I've gone through it myself, and I've helped him with a couple of other deliveries. So definitely a great program. We've got our free webinar series that you will be notified of. And if you're ever interested in some of the other programs that we have to offer, Lean Six Sigma, leadership, change management, or coaching, feel free to reach out anytime. So once again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And as I mentioned, this is being recorded. I will send out a link and a copy of today's deck. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask now. Otherwise, have a wonderful afternoon, and I hope that we will see you again next month.